Hello and welcome back to the Hub. This is our first episode of the new year. Feels good to be back and to start again. So welcome. We also have our first repeat guest, Stuart Johnson. Stuart's first appearance on the Hub was during the 2020 election cycle. In that episode, we discussed why Stuart was supporting Joe Biden as a presidential candidate. I recommend going back and listening to it. I did. It was helpful. This current episode is to discuss how the Biden presidency has gone 1 year in. What has happened? Have expectations been met? What are some of the wins and losses of the Biden presidency? Etc., etc. This episode is a bit different and longer as we discuss and sometimes debate different viewpoints on current issues and what each party thinks are the current issues. I learned a lot in this discussion and hope you do as well. Let's get started. Before we dive into the episode, I asked Stuart to send me his thoughts on Afghanistan and the Biden's handling of the withdrawal. During the episode, we focused mainly on domestic issues. We did not get to discuss Afghanistan. Here are his comments on the Afghanistan pullout. For alternative viewpoints, please refer to two episodes that I did at the end of season 3. One with a veteran who served in Afghanistan and someone who has a more of a libertarian viewpoint with regards to foreign policy. Stuart's comments. First, the pullout was tragic. The stories of the fall, the imagery, all of it was heartbreaking. Second, the exit was not executed sufficiently by Biden. Shameful is an accurate description. Third, every president that campaigned on leaving Afghanistan failed. This includes Trump. Fourth, Trump's peace talks with the Taliban and the management of troop withdrawal effectively sealed the fate of Afghanistan. Total troops were only 2,500 by the time Trump left office. This was unsustainable. 5. Ultimately, there was no path to victory. What actually constituted victory in Afghanistan? How do you judge and sustain anti-terrorist operations on a hostile foreign soil? I'm not sure. 6. Biden's policies weren't much different than Trump's. They just included less lying. Biden bit the bullet and refused to pass the conflict on to another president. 7. Blame the American public for extending a no-win political test, supporting a mission without the will to see it through. All right, welcome back to the Hub, Stuart. You were my first guest to make a second appearance, so
it's an honor.
we're thrilled to have you on. We were joking a little bit earlier about how it's Biden supporters sometimes are like Trump supporters. You want to talk to them and see, explain what's going on and just hear their viewpoint, but they're never, they're not willing to come on or not willing to talk. And
yeah,
but no, I think this will be great. I think, you're super knowledgeable. You've done your homework, and I think a lot of listeners will be excited to kind of hear, maybe a different viewpoint or maybe, explain things a little bit differently. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and dive right on into it.
Okay.
So we're about a year in to the Biden presidency, and let's just talk about what's been the biggest wins in your view of the Biden presidency, and then what's been the biggest surprises.
Sure. I'll throw in a couple of caveats here before I start jumping in. I do have a goal with the podcast. I don't want to sound like an unyielding, ideological, Biden proponent, because I don't feel like I am that. And I want to sort of reasonably explain my opinions on the administration. And I need to give that caveat because I think some of what I might say might come across as sort of being a Biden apologist, but I just want to sort of disclaim that just out of the gate. But a year in, if I had to give Biden a letter grade, I'd probably go C+ range. Personally, I might bump that up to a B- if you're taking modern political realities into consideration. Because I do think he's been hamstrung by a lot of factors, which we'll get into. But yeah, I think that's my overall grade. Biggest surprise from the administration. sort of in a negative manner, I'd say the handling of the
Anyway,
pandemic. Yeah, I think I was, well, especially in hindsight, with the prevalence of Delta and then Omicron, it became pretty clear that vaccines were not the only solution to the issue. I think that's sort of the end game, but I think there were a lot of stopgap measures that were overlooked, and um, I had hoped for a stronger federal action in terms of like mobilizing for testing, tracing, masking infrastructure. I think Delta and especially Omicron sort of laid bare our testing capabilities. I could speak to that sort of anecdotally. I got sick in December, and getting tested at one of the sites was pretty easy. It's pretty clear cut. The other site was, we were in line for like 2-3 hours. So I think that's been the story for a lot of folks, and they can relate to that. And then ultimately, why are we still wearing cloth masks? We should all be wearing N95s, KN95s. That was just, it never really felt like it was a focus for the administration. And then I'm a bit disappointed in sort of the support for what I think most people would view as a strained healthcare system. And again, I don't know all the intricacies that could be involved here, but it felt like there might be an opportunity to mobilize some latent resources in terms of like the National Guard or the military, pull out the federal checkbook, start throwing money at the problem. It feels like, it would be difficult in the short term to recruit the talent required in the healthcare system. That's not something you could just ramp up from a labor perspective very quickly. However, it feels like there could be some easy wins there and some solutions, and it just felt like there hasn't really been much there. I think Biden mentioned he was deploying maybe like 1,000. I think it was members from the military, maybe it was the National Guard, to help out a couple hospitals, but it just felt pretty small. So I think that's the biggest surprise. And I know a year and a half ago when I was on, I sort of laid out these ideas as things I would have liked to seen in the handling of the pandemic. And ultimately, I think Biden did place most of his chips on mass vaccination. And, here we are. And obviously, there's been some issues with getting folks vaccinated, but clearly the pandemic is still very much a challenge. I don't put it all on him specifically, because I think any president, obviously Trump struggled with the pandemic, any president would be struggling, but I definitely thought he would have handled this a bit more effectively.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, let me uh, let me phrase kind of the frustration maybe some people have felt with the Biden administration. Is he campaigned on, hey, I'm going to shut this virus down,
Yeah.
which was rather a bold claim.
Yep.
So I think there's a lot of frustration there. And
Yep.
then you talked about, he relied on mass vaccination, which, people have strong feelings one way or another about vaccines, but, overall they seem to be pretty safe, pretty effective, but they don't seem to be, as you said, like the end all, or, they more recently they haven't stopped transmission of
Yep.
Now, could you argue that was because, people weren't vaccinated and, a strain was able to develop, or, who knows what the implications of, a good majority of people not being vaccinated. But it feels like, for me, the focus has been off on the Biden administration in terms of scoring political points rather than actually like providing help. For example, mask help. I think there's a lot of debate about how much they help, right? They help marginally, I think, is kind of the issue. But I mean, we're still arguing over, where to, like, when to wear a mask or when not to wear a mask. It's kind of like,
Yep.
We're arguing over, something that moves the needle on the margin at best. Why aren't we, approving drugs faster, like the COVID pills? Why aren't we, like you said, if people want to get more tests, why aren't we focusing more on getting testing? It just seems like there's been a lot of focus on scoring political points. The vaccine mandate, like, how long did the Biden administration keep pushing that when it becomes clear that, the vaccines aren't going to stop transmission? Yeah, maybe they'll help you avoid getting super sick, or especially if you're high risk. But for me, it just seems like there hasn't been, and to your point, government is, Trump struggled with it, Biden struggled with it. I think it's more a symptom of the government. I think a lot of other places have adapted, shown, flexibility, whether that's, hey, have to have a COVID test or be vaccinated before you enter this place. But once, there seems to be, everyone else seems to shown a lot of flexibility except for the government. And it's been kind of a little frustration to see, the administration keep kind of pushing stuff like, spend a lot of energy on the vaccine mandate. And it's like, look, the people who are going to get vaccinated probably have already been vaccinated. Those that aren't, marketing 101, right? Are you selling to your love group, or are you just kind of force the hate group? And, so there's, I don't know, that's kind of I feel like there's a lot of frustration. I mean, people have more frustration, but reasonable way, I feel like that's kind of the main frustration of the Biden administration's response to the pandemic. I don't know if that's, if you would agree with that, or if you could understand that kind of point of view.
Yeah, I think I do. I think it is reasonable. I agree with your comment that shutting down the virus was probably a bold claim, because again, I don't think any president with where America's at could actually effectively do that, especially knowing now with how quickly it mutates and the efficacy of the vaccines. I remember, actually have a note here that he declared victory over the virus on Independence Day, and right. It felt very sort of like Trumpian in nature. And that's actually sort of another comment that surprised me about Biden was, I just broadly bracketed it in communication. And I'll get to your other points in a second, but sort of the verbiage surrounding the unvaccinated population has been a lot more aggressive than I would have thought. And I did read an interesting Atlantic article about that, and it looks like this is sort of a popular political tool that is being more utilized by world leaders, especially like Emmanuel Macron. It's sort of like pitting the vaccinated against the unvaccinated, because it's just a bigger group. So you have a little bit more to gain. And then a lot of the communication around like Joe Manchin, I know there's a lot of pressure there, and then it's been, I read an interesting opinion article in the Wall Street Journal that about, I think it was a press conference Biden gave, and it felt very self-congratulatory. We've done more than any modern American president in a single year, and like that's straight out of the Trump playbook. And I don't know if that's, maybe he rewrote the playbook and that's just how presidents will communicate going forward, but it's difficult to square that with reality. And I think in my view, he loses points there, at least with me, and certainly with, the folks that you're speaking to, and with the frustrations. To your points about sort of beating their head against the wall of vaccine mandates, I think I hadn't really considered it from that perspective. I had looked at it differently, but I think I agree. Obviously, the vaccine has been pretty widely available for quite some time now, and so it is reasonable to state that most people who wanted to get vaccinated have gotten it. I do think there probably should be more flexibility from the administration in terms of approaching from a different avenue for solutions. And I think that the communication, like with masks, I agree that generally masks, especially cloth masks, definitely don't do anything. In fact, there's a very renowned epidemiologist at the University of Minnesota, where I'm at, Michael Osterholm, who I think described cloth masks as nothing more than face decoration against the vaccine.
But you remember the big push for wearing double mask and wearing cloth.
Yeah.
It's like, look, if they really are just face decorations, like why did we have all this show and dog and pony show for masks?
Yeah.
It's like,
and I don't know. I'd be interested to see at least in my view, from what I've read, it feels like, especially moving to Delta and then Omicron, it felt like masks definitely lost some of the efficacy. So,
Right.
maybe there was a case once upon
True,
a time, maybe
true.
less so now, and
Different
moving to
strains.
N90.
Different.
Yeah, exactly.
That is an important nuance. So yeah, thanks for calling me out on that.
But I agree, and I guess even if the administration was right in pushing masks as a solution, it feels like there hasn't been a lot of unity across like the health advising uh infrastructure at surrounding the White House. The CDC, Fauci, Biden have all sort of like blundered sort of in turns. Feels like the circle of like, well, mask, well, don't, well, mask in these situations, and it just kind of cycles around. And it definitely complicates the situation for folks like you or I who are just trying to, do what we can to avoid COVID and avoid spreading it. And whereas maybe once it had been clear what to do, now it feels very unclear. It is not easily understood by the average American, I think, unless you're very closely following it, which, to be 100% honest, I haven't been as much in the last 6 months. Part of it's my life's been pretty busy with a number of changes, but part of it's just been a little bit of exhaustion, which I think most Americans would relate to.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's a couple of points I wanted to reemphasize, but I think you just bring up a good point. The communication hasn't been good. And, it's easy to criticize the CDC, Fauci, the administration. And I think a lot of it is warranted and valid. I mean, it's a nuance, like it's a new virus. Like there's a lot of things that, scientists are still learning about it. It just would have, and I think maybe it's more just the underlying frustration with kind of government policy in general is like a lot of times you're just trying to force and control people. When it's, if Fauci or the CDC would have said, hey, look, the evidence suggests, taking more of a nuanced approach rather than just saying, like, you have to do this or you have to do this.
Right.
I think, a lot more Americans would have responded better. And, I think they were so worried about, it's been, the response to the pandemic has been politicized. And part of that was because Trump was in office and the media really and Democrats really wanted to like pin it on him. And I think there's a response on now that Democrats are in charge, they don't want to be seen as incompetent. Maybe that was the charge that Trump had. And so they maybe go overboard and maybe overreact. I totally would get it if most people who catch the virus seem to have recovered okay. Different for, high risk individuals, people who are obese, old, other underlying heart conditions. There's lots of other factors, but there didn't seem to be a nuanced approach to that. And if the focus is more, if the focus would have been more on testing, giving people, vaccines or monoclonal antibodies, or even just simply, recognizing natural immunity, or I don't know. There just seems to be like a lot of other responses, but the Biden administration was trying to score points, I feel like, rather than actually trying to resolve the crisis, and it's not really fair to say like, the virus is going to spread. If you really wanted to shut down the virus, you would have to do what China's doing and, put people in lockdown, close off whole cities and, have people not leave their house forever. That's not a realistic response here in America. So.
Yeah. And I just want to make one more point, because I think I agree broadly with some of the things you're saying. And it's like, as much as it pains me as a Democrat to think that, we're scoring points, which is something I would never hope that either party would really be doing. I think there's definitely something there. This is something I've sort of wrestled with the past couple of weeks is what does victory or a positive outcome really look like again in the pandemic? And I think if you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, it would have been maybe about, limiting spread, maybe, or maybe limiting deaths. Something I think is not considered enough, and I think deserves some attention, is the prevalence of long COVID. I think it's about 10% of cases. Anecdotally, I've read a lot about it, and it is pretty scary. And again, I don't think it's well understood. It's certainly not well covered in the media, and it's sort of difficult to wrap your head around in terms of percentages and case counts, and such a focus on deaths, and mild cases for Omicron. But I mentioned this just to sort of spur the question of, like, what do we view as success? Because for me,
Yeah.
I would have said, limit COVID period. And I think what you mentioned, and I think what's probably more relevant realistically for America, might be less about that and more about having, trying to get some big wins and mitigating as much as possible within reason. Again, I'm using a lot of vague terms. There's a lot of subjectivity and area for gray area, but I think that's an important question, because I think that would advise the solutions, and I think framing the problem with the outcome in mind, it sort of changes things. At least it changes things for me.
Well, that goes back to my point of the government hasn't shown any flexibility in terms of responses, and it's been a real frustration, because, and you can say the same thing about public schools as well. We have full NFL stadiums, NBA stadiums. They've kind of figured it out. They've gone, NFL's had a full season almost. The NBA's in full swing. They've had cases, they've had protocols, but the season's still going on, and they've shown flexibility, adapting, and it just doesn't seem to have had that same level of creativity, flexibility within the government.
Yep.
Thanks for that. I kind of want to pivot a little bit more to this idea that Biden maybe has sounded a little bit like Trump in some instances. And a couple instances come to mind. The speech that he gave down in Georgia about, Jim Crow laws 2.0.
Sure.
And then kind of like you were saying, pitting the vaccinated against unvaccinated, or declaring, victory against COVID July 4th or right before then. I think for a lot of people, I would say Republicans who maybe voted for Biden, it was kind of a sense of Trump's a little crazy. We're tired of hearing about him. We're tired of him making it all about him. We're tired about, June 6th was a real black mark on Trump and Republicans. And it's kind of like, nope, like we don't want that.
Right.
And Biden comes along, and his whole thing was, hey, I'm not going to transform America. I'm not Bernie Sanders. I'm not left wing. And I'm super old. That kind of, like, he can't be radical, right? He's so old.
Sure.
Like,
right.
There's got to be some sort of benefit to experience and being so old. Like, he's going to be a calm hand, moderate hand, stabilizing influence. And I think a biggest surprise for me has been Biden just taking all of his cues from the progressive left. Is that fair to say, or is that me misreading it, or reading, biased newspapers that say that's the charge?
Yeah, I would generally agree with that statement. I think
he ran on. Hey, I'm not. I'm not Bernie. I'm center of the road. We're not going to, do this thing. And then all of a sudden he's in office, and he's pushing all these policies that people are kind of wondering, wait, I thought I voted for Biden, not Bernie.
Yeah. And I think, I agree to a point that there is definitely inspiration from the far left wing in his policy. Inspiration might be a soft word. I think there's definitely, that is a large factor into his policy making, and his moves since being in office. I think, well, I will note that I think there maybe have been a couple of hints that this might have happened, and they were they're pretty small breadcrumbs, but I remember listening to a podcast about the reveal of his climate plan, and it was shortly before the election, and it was surprisingly progressive. Now that is one piece of a puzzle, and there's not a lot of other things that would have suggested he would behave this way. I have thought about this a lot, and I think this might be sort of the age old dichotomy of what you say to get elected and what you actually do. Because I think it's smart politically. I don't know. Obviously, I would, knowing what I know about you, Matt, I would call you generally a moderate. I think that might be fair to say, or at least somewhere in the central band. And certainly his policies are not designed for you. I think I have a couple notes here. I think 2020, the election specifically, sort of showed that Biden, and I remember we talked about this a year and a half ago. Do we attract the moderates, or do we inspire the base? And more or less, I'll put those at different ends of the equilibrium, because I think I'm not sure you can do both effectively. I think he has positioned himself as energizing the base. I think that's what the 2020 election showed him, that this was the path to success, and this is what I need to do to set up future success for the party. And I think that's driven his policy. And I don't think it's I don't think it's as if AOC and the squad are like in there in the Oval Office writing legislation. These are the points we want. But I think he definitely is following some of their suggestions and their lead, and that is crafting his points for sure.
Yeah. Well, would you like to? Well, I think I want to ask maybe about specific issues and hear
Great.
maybe your kind of thinking, your response to it. I'll kind of give my view, which I would say more or less is center right, or even libertarian viewpoints.
Okay.
Just an alternate viewpoint. Maybe that's a better way to say it. It's an alternate viewpoint, and then maybe you can explain why there's such a push, or there's a Democratic push for XYZ. Does that sound
sure?
Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay, let's start with climate change, or the Green New Deal, or whatever you want to call it. It was a big part of the Build Back Better plan. It was the part that Joe Manchin didn't really like, because there's coal plants. West Virginia has a lot of coal mines. I have a friend who works in the coal mine in Ohio. It was kind of a war on coal to get rid of it. Coal is a dirty pollutant. I think that's pretty well understood.
Mm-hmm.
From my viewpoint, when I look at the squad or the progressive left and pushing climate-friendly policies, totally fair to say, yeah, sure, push solar, push wind, that's totally fine. But it's not realistic in terms of the energy demands, or the energy we need to sustain life. Why aren't we including nuclear? And we've kind of talked about this.
Yeah.
Look, nat gas isn't carbon neutral, but it's much cleaner than coal, and we have a lot of availability here in the U.S. And I see what's happening in Europe, where Germany's essentially gotten rid of their natural gas and their nuclear, and their amount of emissions has climbed drastically, because wind and solar isn't reliable. And so what have they had to do? They've had to fire up coal plants, your worst pollutant, and they're trying to be super green. And then they can't have any flexibility in terms of geopolitical, because they're importing a ton of gas from Russia.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, I'm like, how does this make sense from a national security perspective, from a climate perspective? You can say, look, we want to be carbon neutral, totally 100%, but I mean, so that's kind of my viewpoint. What would you say the other side is, or what's the other viewpoint?
Yeah, so I follow climate pretty closely, because I am trying to pivot somewhere into the space. So I hope I have some good points to bring to the table. I guess my view from an opinion on the Green New Deal and coal is, I guess I never viewed it as, and maybe I'm just not comfortable enough with the actual provision and the language in the legislation, but I never felt like it was a deliberate war on coal. Like, to be quite frank, as an economist, like coal is not competitive in the future. It's just flat out not going to be a fuel source for the future. I completely agree that it's got to be a part of the puzzle right now, because you can't just phase out all these coal plants tomorrow. This is a necessary infrastructure for the moment. I think the other economist argument is, if we were to actually allocate the social cost of these pollutants upon these fuel feedstocks, then they would be immediately uncompetitive. So I think, if, speaking from my personal perspective, I think we have to pivot to a not even really net zero, sort of gets thrown around a lot, and I don't really love the language there, because, well, that's a whole other subject we could get into, but we need to pivot to a clean energy system ASAP, because that drives energy is the primary contributor of greenhouse gases in modern society.
Sure.
And to get there, it does need to be completed in sort of a metered fashion. I completely agree that nuclear is part of the solution. I think, obviously, the environmentalists will throw their hands at me for saying something like that. But realistically, to get to clean energy, existing nuclear power plants should not be shut down, and we should be greenlighting future nuclear as well, because the reality is, it is clean, large capacity baseload power, and the risks are much lower now. Now, in terms of the economics of construction and timelines, this isn't something, we greenlight a nuclear power plant, it gets built in 3 years. This is a 10 to 15-year commitment, so it's really a solution for the future. But keep existing nuclear and greenlight the future. Coal, I don't think, I think a carbon tax is an interesting market solution to the problem, and that's another subject. But we'll see if we get there, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
If that was sort of enacted, then I think I actually don't think you would need wind and energy support really at all to see the transition move pretty quickly. Obviously, we don't have a carbon tax now, and so I think the wind and energy subsidy should be there. But I think I would agree that attacking coal outright is probably not the right way to get there in the long run. And obviously, there's sort of the more sensitive aspect of, this is eliminating a large part of jobs in a sensitive area in the country that, maybe lower income, maybe lower education. I think with the right committing of resources and education, that workforce could properly transition to the modern clean energy economy, which I think could be an important part of the solution. So I know that's sort of all over the place, but I think I addressed most of your points there, at least on energy.
Yeah, no, that was fair. And there is I would say, a social cost. I would agree with you on dirty pollutants. No one wants to be breathing in bad air, hacking up a lung, because the coal power plant is, spewing out pollutants. I don't think a carbon tax is ever going to happen, because progressives don't like it, because the lower income people really feel it. I don't know if they would be in favor of the nuclear power generation. Again, it kind of goes back to the same point of, there seems to be a goal to score political points or please certain groups, rather than thinking creative about solving the problem. If we were really thinking creatively, we'd be like, yeah, let's go ahead, fund nuclear power, come up with a new way. Maybe instead of fission, we do fusion, or hydrogen power, or some of these other things. Wind and solar, or even battery technology, I'm a little skeptical of that, because a lot of that innovation hasn't happened, and a lot of the raw materials needed to build the batteries are come from China. And how does China do it? They mine. And China doesn't really strike me as the most environmentally sensitive, especially when it comes to mining. So it just, again, it kind of just is like, wait, this doesn't really make sense in terms of, if the goal is really to eliminate, carbon emissions, I don't know if giving a ton of business to mines in China to mine this stuff is a really practical solution, but maybe not.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree that environmentally it's a tough pill to swallow because all these technologies do require rare earth minerals. I think from the direct climate impact, avoided greenhouse gas emissions are a much better trade-off for mining, which is just sort of a blunt fact, I think, in the space. But I agree that as part of a move towards a clean energy economy and just general just transition in the time of climate change, there are going to be certain groups that lose. Is just the unfortunate reality, and that's probably going to be laid to bear in the next 10 years. We're going to really start seeing that, and that some communities are going to be hard hit. And I think, anyone who's looked at climate science is very properly scared, and I think would make the argument for, we have to do what's right for the many, for the planet, and we have to find a way to solve those new problems for those marginalized communities, as unfortunate as that is.
Sure. Let's sacrifice some groups for the greater whole. That sounds.
I know it sounds like that sounds very
sound
blunt and pessimistic, but like the negative outcomes, like the amount of GDP shaved off the economy each year, like close to 2,100, is very scary. So I think it's difficult. Brief aside, it's difficult to square these things up in our brains because humans aren't really designed to grasp these very large numbers and to you've run a DCF analysis, you discount a cash flow 40 years out in the future, that's only worth like 10 cents today, right? It contributes very little to how we value something in the present day. So our models right now just don't accurately help us. They don't help us accurately grasp the gravity of the situation.
I would say, those models, climate models, super hard to model, right? Climate is dynamic. It's a dynamic flowing model. So your inputs are dynamic, which is really tough to model when you're trying to, get outputs as well. But these models have tend to overestimate, I would say, the impact. Now we can argue about how big of the impact, or maybe they haven't, or, maybe they are accurate. The fair point.
Yeah.
No one really.
Yeah, it is difficult to model, and there's and to be clear, in the climate space, and I'm not trying to turn this into a climate change podcast. So cut me off at any point, but it's all these things are interconnected. It's not as simple as like, oh, we have to worry about climate change. It's there's unprecedented biodiversity loss. There's risks to global food systems, stemming from climate events and just their general industrial agriculture policies and frameworks. There's a lot of other like health out. You were talking about pollution. If you read about air pollution, especially Salt Lake City, we know how this is because there's bad air quality. Air quality, I think, globally costs, I think it's 8 million deaths a year. It's something outrageous. And these are these things, these invisible killers. It's difficult to understand and to put in perspective. So I get the other side, and I'm going to keep, pushing for what I think is right in the space. But certainly from the energy perspective, I think the more moderate approach of not blatantly phasing out coal is, I think, maybe let the market do that sort of on its own, because I think that will happen very soon.
Right. If nuclear is part of the energy puzzle, coal can't compete and they'll go out of business. You don't need to, have this mess. Anyways, climate's a hot topic for you. So let's talk about.
Okay.
I'm gonna fire off 3 things real quick.
Okay.
Inflation, crime, public education. In my mind, those are three more pressing issues than climate change.
Yep.
Would you agree with that?
I think they're more present in the minds of Americans.
Okay, fair. Good point. Nice political. Nice diplomatic answer.
Thanks.
Inflation. I think Biden gets a lot of crap for his policies, and I do agree he's stimulated demand. I mean, he's a Keynesian. All of his advisors are Keynesian, and there's a fair point for it. They passed a 1.9 trillion bill, flooded the market with dollars, stimulated a lot of demand. But I think a main player in this space that gets overlooked is the Federal Reserve. Essentially, Milton Friedman's always said, inflation everywhere and always is a monetary problem. And it's basically you're printing too many dollars for what's happening. So I think the Fed's been behind the ball. I think they've overstimulated, and my response would be they need to pull back, which they are, but I also feel like they're a little late. And I do think Biden has, pushing the wrong policies rather than focusing on increasing supply. And I think that's just a general statement as well. I could apply that to vaccines, to testings. Mm-hmm. If we were focusing on increasing the supply of the healthcare system, whether it's pills, testing, whether it's increasing the supply of goods and services, I think that would be a better. If I was Biden advisors, that's what I'd be pushing Biden to do, and I think he could. He would. I think it would, score pretty well for his constituents and whatnot. What are your thoughts?
Well, I did do a bit of research and sort of reflection on this topic, and you and I, we're economists, and so we could sort of frame this in from the economist lens, and I completely agree. I think I do agree that the infrastructure bill would be inflationary. I think that's sort of obvious. I won't comment too much on the infrastructure bill, but I'll just put that there. And I do think, there stimulus checks. There was a number of things that have happened over the past 2 years to create certainly demand pull inflation. But I agree that I wouldn't put most of this on Biden, and I think supply side improvements could help. I think there could be some policies there that could be effective. A couple of notes, from the cost push side. Some of these supply chain issues are difficult to abate. I think he's made a couple of good moves in terms of trying to improve the truck driving workforce, as well as streamlining support and trade processes to sort of move things along quicker. Obviously, energy inputs have gone up in terms of labor, in terms of energy, and there's not a ton he can do with energy because he actually has been his oil and gas leasing moratorium was overruled. I think I actually just saw today that the courts pushed back on that again. So maybe that'll have an impact, but that's been overruled. It's not like he's really shut that down too much. And besides, I don't think the U.S. is a big enough. They're not a swing producer right now to really move the needle in terms of gas prices, in my opinion. But I think I agree with the Fed. I don't know why we've had 0% interest rates for 14 years. I've thought we should have pulled the plug on that a while ago. And you can make some arguments. Oh, well, the market, and we weren't ready. I guess I always view the Dow Jones or the S&P 500 as a terrible indicator for what's actually happening in the economy. And if there's a hit there, 10% hit, sorry, tough. it's been a 15-year bear or bull market. You're fine.
Yeah.
So I'm glad they're tapering. I'm glad there's rate increases. I'm not my portfolio is taking a bit of a nosedive, but that's this needed to happen. Yeah. This needed to happen. So yeah, I agree with everything you said. Being a Democrat and a Biden supporter, I'll put a little bit more of that on some things that I don't think are fully in his control, but I do agree that some supply side moves would be smart and the right move.
Yeah, I'm going to push on two things that you said. One, getting more truckers. I don't think the vaccine mandate has helped at all.
Okay.
Truck drivers are generally by themselves driving. And if there's a big backlog in the LA port, but truck drivers, in order to pick up the stuff from the port, have to be vaccinated, and there's a good portion of them that are not, I don't see how that helps the workforce, helps these supply issues at all. So
Sure.
I would push back on that and say I think he's hurt more there than he's helped. Second,
Sure.
Gas prices. The economy is so complex, like it's not fair to really put high gas prices on a president. In my view, other people think differently, but I will say a lot of emphasis, and this kind of goes back to climate, is we don't want any investing in dirty oil, and we don't want any investing in drilling. We're going to pull back on supply. We're going to limit the oil and gas leases. And I know it's been overturned, but it's been a year or so, and the rhetoric coming out of the administration is very anti current energy producers. And the SEC, the Fed, they're talking about incorporating climate risk into the stress testing, how things get funded. You need to disclose it in terms of the capital markets as a climate risk and things like that. This has an impact. And so I would say, yeah, I know his policies, his moratorium on gas and land leasing has been overturned, but there's been a lot of other regulations that have really crimped supply. So I do think in this case, energy policy maybe can be traced back to the president.
And I'll have one riposte on that in terms of I think those are fair points to raise, because I do agree. I will freely admit that Biden has taken sort of a pessimistic stance on the oil and gas industry. He's certainly not trying to expand it, or at least not actively trying to expand it. I will say,
when you have to beg Saudi Arabia to pump more oil, that strikes me as the wrong policy implementation.
Yeah, and there's a couple other things at play. A lot of these low oil prices over the years have not supported a lot of new drilling. A lot of drilling in these fracking basins cost structures have bottomed out. Like there's no efficiencies to be gained anymore. So I think there could be an argument just from a free market perspective that there wasn't enough investment over the past couple of years, regardless of what's going on from a regulatory perspective, to counter maybe this demand pull, I guess the supply crunch. And then just on the point of the climate risk, yes, absolutely, that there has been a push by the SEC and some of these other institutions. But increasingly, I would actually argue it's not necessarily. I would argue that the pivot in the space, and you could look at Larry Fink with BlackRock, you could look at a lot of these other institutional investors in terms of what they're looking for now, is they're looking for ESG disclosure. And now that's a whole other thing that I could get into, and I won't, because I sort of derailed this earlier on climate change. But ESG is something that companies are going to be increasingly judged on, and that's not. I don't think that's primarily being driven by the government. I think that is primarily being driven by investors, and so I would argue it's sort of a twofold push there, and that just the market is now demanding these disclosures, and it's absolutely increased the cost of capital, certainly for coal companies, definitively, and then probably for oil and gas, by a significant margin, and that it's difficult for them more difficult to fund their operations.
It reminds me of, a little off topic, but when the European press passed the regulation for data privacy laws, and there was a lot of concern about monopoly power from Facebook, Amazon, and they were also concerned about privacy, so they passed this regulation. And essentially what happened was the only people that could meet the standards of the regulation were the big companies, were Amazon and Facebook. So essentially they created stronger barriers of entry for new players to come in, and they helped really resupport the dominant players in the industry that they didn't want to help. And I think with this ESG regulation and push, I think a lot of it, I think more transparency into what a company is doing is great, and the costs associated with their operations, like in terms of what they do, is great. But I think we need to be a little bit thoughtful that a lot of these regulations, the only people that can essentially meet these high bars are big oil and gas companies. It's not these smaller producers. In my mind, I could be wrong, but that's kind of my view. Is like these, there's cost to regulation as well, and the Exxon, the Shell, these guys are the ones that can easily afford it and do it. But I don't know if the smaller players could.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think on the surface, it definitely holds water. I can't speak specifically to oil and gas. I can speak to just general ESG disclosures. A lot of companies aren't being held to a specific bar just yet. And again, maybe the climate risk from the SEC might be a little bit different, but ESG hasn't really coalesced around a single set of standards. That's a really big hot topic in the space. And it's unclear if that's really going to happen. In fact, there's a fair amount of folks in the space that think ESG is just a bunch of hot air. These are folks espousing these sort of ideals. They think ESG is just sort of a greenwashing tactic to attract investment. I'm not sure how it's going to shake out, as is no one else is either. But I think given that the lack of coalescence around a single set of standards, combined with there's actually a lot of interesting startups in the climate space that are getting funded, and they're all tech companies that work on this sort of thing. They're carbon accounting throughout the supply chain. They're tracking. There's an interesting startup that I was talking to. They do sort of methane emission tracking and removal for oil and gas companies. So I think there's probably a point there, and that there's growing pains, especially for the smaller players. But I don't think it would be, in my view, it wouldn't be a big enough cost to really create friction for them to evolve, I guess.
Fair. No, that's a good point. And I think you might be right on that point. I think you're right. Because we've talked before about some companies that are innovating and doing a lot of cool stuff, even with regulation and taking on the big players. So you're probably more up to speed on that, and probably a little bit more accurate on what's happening. So fair. Let's talk about crime. You're in Minnesota, Minneapolis, Twin Cities.
Yep.
Big push to change dollars from change funding to the police department to more overall social services, whether that's maybe you can speak better to the actual departments, but helping homeless, healthcare, whatever the case might be. I think there's this idea, and I think I agree, that police are asked to do too much.
Yep.
And so let's repurpose some of the dollars to why does the police department need hundreds of millions of dollars to and put some of it to maybe more drug rehabilitation and whatnot.
Yep.
I think the data and what we've seen more recently is a lot of rising crime in big cities. Do you think it's fair to say that, like, what would your response be to the rising crime in big cities?
Well, I think it's a fair comment to recognize it. For starters, I'll share anecdotally. I drive a Prius. My catalytic converter was stolen.
Oh, really?
It was, in November. It was stolen here in Minneapolis. That was expensive repair. I will counter also in that, folks thinking, oh, it's Minneapolis. It was also stolen in Salt Lake City just 3 months prior. So I've had, not trying to draw attention to my very, very poor luck with my car, but I am trying, anecdotally.
It's a cool Prius. We taking trips in the Prius.
Everyone who knows me personally knows the Prius. Yes, that's very true. But I think it is an issue. I've spoken to some of my colleagues, and full disclosure, this is not something I really, really follow closely. So I wouldn't say I'm extremely educated on the subject. Having talked to some of my colleagues who have lived in the Minneapolis area for some time, they've noticed it as well. And I think there's a fair argument. And I think I agree with what you said. I think the police are asked to do too much. Not every conflict requires a police officer with a gun. I think that's just sort of fair to say. I don't think we've gotten it right yet in terms of, well, what is the solution? What's the substitute? And I would, I guess the optimist in me would hope that this is part of just sort of the growing pains to figure that out, but it's a real problem. So I don't have the answers. I think it is a problem. And I think it's a fair comment to make about issues in big cities and potentially, against the Biden administration, whatever he might be able to do from the bully pulpit.
Right. I think the concern, and I think why people try to tie this to Biden, I don't know if it's really fair, and I don't think it is, because police departments are local, right? Yep. They're local communities, the state, federal government really can't do too much, I guess I would say. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it's totally fair. I think the main concern is if Biden administration is taking cues from the left and the progressive left is defund the police.
Yeah.
It's kind of, okay, well, where does he stand? How come he's not?
Yeah.
And I think I would be in favor. I think police have a little too much power. Any government agency, I'm more for transparency, holding people accountable. I just haven't really seen an emphasis on making police departments more transparent, holding them more accountable. And, some of that is unions. So right. I would like to transition to public schools.
Yeah.
Because I think the same underlying issue is the problem. You have a lot of these government employees, public employees, that the student really isn't the customer, they're the product. And
right.
It's more about protecting the job of the teacher, of the government employees. And that's a broad brush. I know there's some excellent teachers, excellent administration, excellent public, but you look at the underlying structure and it seems like that the emphasis, the real protection is protecting jobs of the public employees.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's fair to, fair to kind of say the loss of learning, especially in lower income minority students, can we put that on the Biden administration, or is, again, kind of like with crime, he doesn't really have that much influence or things to say?
I think I'll start by saying I think all he could do is speak on it. I don't think he has much power, and even speaking on it, I think, if you looked at somewhere that's like hyper left, maybe like a California school district in LA or San Francisco, that's going to be out of his control, certainly. Maybe on the margin, like more moderate school districts, he could have kind of sort of weigh in and help guide policy. But I think I would put that on Biden myself. I would like to clarify a point. I happen to have a fair amount of friends in public education, but primarily music education. And I just want to say, to clarify a point, when you say protect the role, I guess I'd like to say, protect the teacher in terms of COVID, in terms of the risks that go along with teaching in a COVID classroom, because I don't think any teacher is genuinely afraid of their job being at risk. In fact, there's a massive teacher shortage. Like, it's very difficult to find good teachers given just the fundamentals of incomes in the space. So with that, I'll speak to that specifically. I think a lot of this has been politicized, as has most of the pandemic. I think the pragmatist in me should say, follow what works, as what you've mentioned many times. And I don't think at this point closing schools makes a lot of sense. I think if vaccinations are available for children 5 to 11, and obviously older, I don't love the argument of children are less affected because, well, whether that's true or not in large studies, it sort of feels like, I just don't like the verbiage. It feels sort of like we're throwing our kids to the wolves, and whether that's true or not, I think, certainly I don't think there's any place for lockdowns really anymore in terms of policy, whether, the public would even have an appetite for it, because I don't think that makes sense in reducing spread. I don't, I'm not educated on the subject enough for masks in schools. I think generally from what I've read, I would say yes, mask in schools. I don't know how much of a loss there is. And again, I'm not an early childhood specialist. I don't know how much of a loss there is in terms of losing, below the eyes in terms of expressions and understanding communication. But I think getting to more to your point of should we be closing down schools to protect teachers, I'd say probably not. And my solution would be to this problem of, and I'm going to sound like a tax and spend liberal, flood the system with money. Education has been consistently, chronically underfunded in America. You can look, and it's not just liberal arts and just music education. This is just pretty much across the board. Utah has one of the lowest spend per pupil. I think it might be the lowest in the nation. Pay teachers more. That'll attract more talent. We can have better substitutes. And then we won't have to deal with this issue. Oh, somebody wants to stay home or they're not comfortable working. Well, we can find a replacement.
Right.
That would be my argument for that. I know that's sort of a tough sell because that probably going to result in raising taxes. But I would challenge anyone to refuse funding the educational system more. It's sort of like one of those policies you probably don't actively go against. Maybe you go against taxing to fund that, but opposing stronger education feels like it would be a win. Or sorry, you know what I'm trying to say. Opposing, it feels like that would be, it would not be a position many folks would take. So I guess that would be my solution. And whether that's the solution or not, I don't know. A couple other things you could do. And again, I don't think they're short-term solutions, but renovating schools with improved ventilations. Like if we're going to renovate buildings for the realities of a modern pandemic, which if it becomes endemic, and this is something we're dealing with every year, get a COVID vaccine, that's probably something we need in building codes. We have to, ventilation in society is not really designed for this. It's designed for a very different set of outcomes. So let's start with schools. Right. I mean, it just kind of sort of makes sense as a starting point for a number of these policies, but that's how I would counter that.
Fair.
And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Two things I'd like to say. Well, I think you're right. Good point. I overlooked the aspect teachers not wanting to catch COVID because I don't know if it's clear how much kids, with the transmission aspect. But it's a good point. I wouldn't want to go to a job if I didn't feel safe.
Yep.
And putting my health on the line. So fair point. That was a good pushback. The 2 points I want to raise with masking in school. Earlier in the podcast, you mentioned your Minnesota professor saying if they're not, N95 masks, then essentially they're worthless. So most kids aren't wearing N95 masks.
Yep.
So it seems a little. Is this just for show kind of thing? Second point, I do think public school, we have increased funding a lot since the 70s. At what point do we say, we stop doing what we're currently doing and keep, increasing funding? Or how much do we say, instead of funding a building or administration or teachers, why don't we fund the student instead and have the dollars follow the student?
Okay.
Then we can let parents and children decide where they want to go. And that's kind of what we do for college, right? We don't.
Sure.
The money follows the student when they go to college, right? And there's no shortage of people wanting to be a professor at a university. If anything, when you graduate from getting your PhD in economics, there's very limited spots open to go.
Yep.
There's not really that issue of teacher shortage, right? So I don't know if that argument really holds water in the sense when I look at another set of college, it doesn't seem to be an issue of teacher shortages.
Right.
So that's kind of what came to my mind. And the funding that we do is different. Now you could argue and say like, oh yeah, but look at all the student debt that has accumulated from university, and you're shackling, these young grads forever basically. So
right.
I think I think, again, kind of the overall point as we've been talking is there just doesn't seem to be a lot of flexibility and creativity in terms of solving issues. It seems more to on the left and the right.
Yeah.
I don't know if the right has really. I think you can't just de-emphasize COVID. It's been a real thing. A lot
Yeah.
of people have died, and just saying, "Oh, we'll just let it do its thing."
Right.
That doesn't strike me as a really, proactive, creative way to solve the issue either. You can't close your eyes and hope it all goes away.
Yeah.
So,
It's not going to go away by Easter.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. And same thing with like the climate issue as well. It doesn't seem like closing your eyes and de-emphasizing like, oh, climate change is not really a thing and it's going to be fine. Like that doesn't strike me as a really creative or you got to acknowledge the issue in the first place before you can solve it. So I know the party in power gets a lot more scrutiny and media, the right media, or whoever always likes to blame things on the administration. And so I thought it might be helpful just to hear from a supporter, Democrat, what you think is like fair to put on the president and what you think is not fair. And, this has been informative because I do think inflation, crime, public education, inflation, maybe, more so on the president, but crime and education, there seems to be a lot of other players in this space that I don't know if you can always just say, oh, this was Biden's fault.
Yeah. And a quick point on your creativity, comment you made. I'm open to new ideas. I'm open to new solutions. If there was a better system for fixing the education system, certainly open to that. And obviously I'm not the policy wonk on education, so I'm sure there's certainly folks out there with better ideas. But I think I guess what I would hope people would take away from this, and maybe they won't, maybe they'll just think I'm a left-wing lunatic, but I'm hoping that I would come across more as a pragmatist, because I think the US is so politicized and divided, potentially more than it's ever really been in modern American history, that picking a side on like which side of the picket you're going to be on and just planting a flag and just chilling there, and having that sort of, oh, well, I'm a Democrat, so I support XX, blah, 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 and this is what I do. And it just feels like it's caused so many problems. And so let's do, science advised smart policy. That's not simply, well, I believe this, so it should be this.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Is there anything else you would like to articulate 1 year in from the Biden administration that we didn't discuss already?
I mean, we could talk about the filibuster. I don't know how we're doing on time, so I'll let you drive. But
let's spend 5 more minutes to talk about the filibuster. The big push to get rid of the filibuster.
Yep.
Why and what are your thoughts?
Well, so I did a bit of research on this to really make sure I was coming at it from the right place, because initially when you hear about the filibuster, and it's been a long time since I've been in a civics class or American government, so you know how that goes. Sometimes you got to refresh. Oh, this is how this works. But sort of on paper, you hear the filibuster, and at least for me, I was thinking, oh, like this has been around since George Washington. This is just sort of built in the Constitution, and it's not. It's sort of, the origin's interesting. It sort of came about when there was a rewriting of Senate rules, and they sort of threw out one of the procedures, and now you can just sort of like endlessly postpone a vote. My view is, I don't think the filibuster is relevant in modern society, and I have a couple points on that. I think the world is changed. So this is even outside like its origins, and sort of it has a pretty racially charged historical use over the past 100 years. I know the last like 20 years, it's been more of a sort of a bargaining chip and getting compromise. But prior to that, it was primarily used to reject or postpone votes on civil rights and like anti-lynching bills. So not good company to keep, right? You know, it's not, granted, you shouldn't just get rid of it just simply because of how it's been used in the past. But I think the world's changing too quickly. I think it might take too much work. And maybe this is harsh to say, maybe this is naive to say, but I think getting an additional 10 senators on, you know, the presumed 50 on a side, it just takes too long. The world's moving too fast. We don't have, you know, tech regulation. That's a question mark. Climate change. That's a question mark. All the issues we've dealt with today that we talked about still not being dealt with. And so I think the argument would be we need to move quicker. That would be my first point. And I could see the wheels turning. I know you're going to have a point on that. I'm happy to discuss that after I get through this. I think the second point I would make is that America's too polarized. And I know that could change. However, it doesn't feel like it ever will change. I mean, in the case of modern, you know, the information age and misinformation, if you will, you can get your news anywhere.
You can believe in reality.
Exactly. I'm not convinced that bipartisanship will ever exist again. And again, maybe that's naive, but it just doesn't feel like, will there ever be a 60-seat supermajority when if you go to the other side of the picket line, you're just smashed to pieces by your party? I don't know. Feels like a lot of the parties and representatives now sort of stand for their deeply ideological positions and like thwarting the other party, you know, like own the libs. That's not policy. That's something. It's political points.
Scoring political points.
Exactly. And if that's the new reality, filibuster can't. I mean, how is any policy going to get changed passed outside of reconciliation or when there's the occasional, you know, blip of, hey, well, we could confirm a Supreme Court justice without the filibuster, you know, those rare cases where the filibuster is sort of removed. And then the last thing I'll say is sort of, you know, the founders were once worried about a tyranny of the majority, which I think is fair from structure. Mm-hmm. And I think the filibuster, you could argue, it's like, well, that's a tool to stop that. Well, I'd sort of argue we have the opposite of that problem now. With current demographics and human geography, we're almost seeing now tyranny of the minority. And maybe that's an extreme comment, but some of these, if you look at a map of the United States and where the population is, and some of these very, very small states are now blocking policy that might be in the best interest of the country, that's bad. No other country works that way. And I did research to follow up on this. No other country in the world has a 60% threshold for ordinary legislation, nor has there been for a century. If we're supposed to be sort of the cradle of democracy, then why do we still have that? Yeah. And no one else does. And it feels like the filibuster is now no longer used as that bargaining chip I mentioned. It's just straight up. I read an article, Mitch McConnell's position in the fall about raising the debt ceiling. It was basically heads I win, tails you lose. Like, you have to govern without us, but you can't govern without us. And that's not governance. That's bad governance.
Right.
Anyway, those are my points.
So maybe to reemphasize the 3 points.
Yep.
The first one was
world's changing too fast.
World's changing too fast. Second one is
America's too polarized.
America's too polarized. And third is it's tyranny of the minority, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent points. Thanks for sharing. I guess I'll respond kind of.
Yeah, please.
You saw my wheels turning. So first one, the world is changing really fast. And I do think the government is a little bit behind on some issues, privacy, tech policy. Mm-hmm. I am a little hesitant of just a lot of these issues, though, in terms of, the government needs to move a little quicker. I am a little hesitant about giving government more power and allowing them to move quicker. We want legislation to be articulated, discussed, debated,
right,
kind of well thought out. We don't want a bad policy that hurts a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
We don't want Plessy versus Ferguson, or
for sure.
We want legislation to be well thought out. Second, and that kind of goes to the second point too, is like legislation is designed to take time. It's the way the system is set up is to force compromise. And yeah, America is very polarized. I think that aspect is overemphasized by the media.
Okay.
And I would look to the data. The Senate has passed 3 bills. Congress has passed 3 bills with bipartisan support. The infrastructure bill, you got 10 Republican senators to come on. There was a China bill that got passed, and there was another bill that got passed as well. So in my mind, I don't want a government that's coming up with a lot of new legislation every day. I feel like government a lot of times gets in the way. I have a more distrustful view of government than maybe a Democrat or a liberal would have. I don't think I don't think government is going to solve our problems. I think government provides order, stability, and I think it works best when it provides that order, provides that stability, provides clear rules, things like that. I like it when government moves slow.
Okay.
If there's a real pressing issue, we have mechanisms where stuff like that gets resolved. Point number 3, tyranny of the minority. And you were really arguing that the structure of the Senate gives too much power to West Virginia instead of California and New York, where the majority of people live. Most people live on the coast. Wyoming, West Virginia, these states should not be holding up legislation designed to benefit everyone. And kind of going back to the founders, I don't want. We have the House of Representatives. That's that was the whole great compromise.
Yeah.
We don't want just it to be a straight. And it's not, our government is not a democracy. It is set up to be a constitutional republic, representative democracy. We don't want California and the most populous state always driving policy, because Utah has very different issues than California, and West Virginia has very different issues than New York. So it's it's a roadblock for the party in power, and I kind of think that it is a good roadblock for the people in power, so that they can't just pass bills that, hey, this is what my party wants. These are what this is what my party wants. When I don't even need to bring in the other side. I'm just going to do what I want to do. That strikes me as very anti-democracy, almost protecting. To me, that's a feature. That's not a bug. It's a feature. It's a feature of our government to say, no, you have to pay attention to the minority, because if not, then it's just a bunch of then it's mob rule. Then it's hey, the majority wins, and and that strikes me as very odd for the Democratic Party to be pushing it when they're all about protecting. Well, they like to claim they're all about protecting the disenfranchised, the minority, the underrepresented groups. And so for me, it's a little interesting that they would be wanting to push something that is designed to protect the minority. Now, I do know that a lot of it was, it's not written in the Constitution. If you wanted to change the Senate rules, to make it more modern or something, but in my mind, the Senate is designed to kind of force. The Senate's supposed to be the more thoughtful house of Congress, right? The senators serve 6 years. It's not every 2 years. There's committees where bills get discussed. It's supposed to be more of a thoughtful, deliberate type of body, which we want. The House of Representatives, sure, you guys do your majority, do whatever you want. That's strict democracy, mob rule. Go for it. But for me, it's a feature. It's not a bug in terms of government, really discuss these issues. And if you think about it, the biggest polarizing issues have been passed without, discuss buy-in from the other side. Obama's healthcare.
Yeah.
You can compare that to the infrastructure bill that Biden passed this year. Has anyone really, no one cares about the infrastructure bill. Like, there's not this huge outrage, but there was a huge outrage for Obamacare. It's like, I don't know. For me, it seems that's a feature, not a bug.
Sure. Yeah, I think those are all reasonable points, and certainly worth consideration, and certainly hold water. I guess one last comment on that. I think when, maybe I'm wrong, when the founders, founded the country and wrote the Constitution and were governing, I don't know how often the order of the day was just sort of like blind loyalty to the party and like blatant obstructionism. And to be clear, I'm not just talking about Republicans. Like, Democrats absolutely suffer from this as well. And
it's a good thing. It's a good thing the country was founded 200 years ago. Not today.
If the Constitution was written today, things would probably be absolute chaos.
Well, it is kind of amazing though that you got to remember, like, the northern states were, they had slaves, but not really. The big issue back then was slavery, and they found a way to compromise. And the other thing was, like, hey, New York has a lot bigger population than, I don't know, freaking North Carolina. I don't know, some state, or Delaware, and it's like, they found a way to compromise too. So,
well, I feel like I have to say this. I don't know about compromise. I know compromising on slavery sort of held the Union together for a bit. Obviously that was a pretty terrible outcome ultimately. Still dealing with the ramifications of that today.
Right.
But I think in general, in a vacuum, I think
actually I will push back on that. I do agree. Slavery is like original sin is what they call it.
Yeah.
And we went to war over it, Civil War. Mm-hmm. With regards to rights, minorities have appealed to the institutions, the very same institutions that the founders set up. When you talk about the civil rights, what institutions did they go to get the civil rights passed? They went through Congress. They went through the Supreme Court. They went through Congress to pass the civil rights. So they appealed to these very same institutions that were initially set up in order to recognize their rights. So in my mind,
but how long were those rights filibustered? I think the longest filibuster on record, Strom Thurmond, was against a civil rights legislation.
Right.
So I agree. I agree in a vacuum that the filibuster has done some good things.
It doesn't have a good history. I agree with you on that. It's hard to know though what would happen if minority rights weren't. If filibuster wasn't there.
I thought about that a lot as I was looking at my points, and it is a fair point. It is a good consideration to think about. And
I do agree. The application of the filibuster has not had a good history with civil rights. I will agree with that. So, awesome. Well, any other comments? I think
no. I think we're good to wrap. I don't want to keep dragging on. I could. So invite me back a third time, I guess.
Well, it's always a pleasure having you on. It's always great to discuss, and I think why it's always fun to having you on here is because I feel like I try to be pragmatic and you try to be pragmatic, even though we might have different philosophies and viewpoints on issues. I think there's a real drive to kind of come up with a working solution, and so that's I think that's helpful, and I think it's helpful for our listeners too to hear the other viewpoint and realize, you know what, like, COVID is a more serious issue than the party that I'm in or usually side with. They're not taking it as big of an issue as it I think it needs to be. So it's always helpful to hear the alternative or a different viewpoint. So thanks for coming on, Stuart. We miss you in our indoor soccer team. We really do. We Seth, a real quick story. We had a game and Seth's wife was there. My wife was there.
Yeah.
And Seth's wife was yelling like, "Hey, get back on defense or something." And then she turned to Celeste and said, "I miss Stuart. Where is Stuart?"
That's pretty good.
I'll leave you with that.
Okay.
You have a great weekend. We miss you and hope to see you soon.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Matt. It's always good to have a discussion. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, thanks again for coming on. We'll see you.
See ya.